I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
I'm here with Deacon Chris May. He's going to be teaching a class in October, starting October 8th at 7 p.m. Central Time. It's called The Spiritual Crises of Modernity. This is on our website. You can just go to pmorin.org and find this and the different ways to connect. And I guess I'll just get started by asking you why you felt it was important to teach this class.
A lot of us walk around with assumptions about reality that we never really question. We take in certain attitudes and unspoken assumptions with our mother's milk, and it's part of the culture. And I'd like to just take a little while and try to examine some of those unspoken assumptions. I'd like to go back to about the year 1300 and look at a few philosophical debates that were going on then, and some of the unintended consequences that those debates had. We'll be looking at what our conception of reality changed, what it meant for something to exist. Specifically, what did it mean for God to exist? This would be the university of being. Changes in our conception of the meaning of God's existence. This leads to a loss of the sense of our always participating in the divine, in the great chain of being, simply by existing. So it introduces a certain uncertainty or insecurity in our existence. The second class will be an extension of the first one, looking at two debates going on around the same time. We call them nominalism and voluntarism, changes in the conception of what it means to talk about God's nature and God's will, and how God came to be seen as unpredictable, characterized by an almost arbitrary will. And this further led to a further sense of insecurity in our lives. The third class, we're looking at the crisis of knowledge, how the limits of knowledge and the rise of science as being the only valid means of knowledge came about. The corollary of this would be a rise of an especially literalistic reading of sacred scripture. Morality becomes private opinion. There's no such thing now as moral reasoning. We seek security by limiting our knowledge only to the scientific, to the countable, to the provable, and by extending our control and manipulation over the natural world. The last course, or last class rather, would be, I called it the crisis of the self, the effects of these changes exacerbated by capitalist neoliberalism on our spiritual and mental health. How these changes contributed to a loss of a sense of community, rise of individualism, the loneliness of modern existence, and how capitalism depends upon cultivating a feeling of insecurity in us. I don't really have a lot of suggestions on where we as a civilization are to go from here. I'd rather focus on some of these changes that happened a few hundred years ago and what we lost as a result, so that we have a better sense of where did we come from and what part of our conception of ourself and what it means to be alive, to be a human person, to live in a society, what part of our assumptions about that are down merely to historical accident.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
a recasting and a re-examination, essentially, of what it is to be a human person.
Right. You said at the beginning, more or less, we kind of live in a world that we take for granted. Like our mother's milk, we don't really understand that where we are now isn't where we absolutely have to be or isn't
Right.
reality itself, right? And so by
Yes.
taking this long step back, you can kind of see more clearly where we are now, why, right? And that it is, I mean, would you say that some of the alienation and the just the, like you say, the crisis of the self in our modern world that leads to mental illnesses and addiction, that happened by accident through a series of sort of accidental events that this is the story that you're going to tell? Or is there a way in which this is all like linked together, that what starts in 1300, right? Or wherever you start sort of necessarily leads in this direction?
Boy, yeah, a lot of the consequences that we're looking at were not intentional. I'll be looking back at some of these critical debates, and it's very easy to cast somebody as being a villain because they propagated these beliefs that had these consequences in our society. Usually, these were people of goodwill, doing their best to try to figure out what it is to be a human person, and they didn't really foresee the consequences of what would happen. I try to have this essentially very optimistic view of human nature. So, I mean, we can point to some things and see, well, yeah, this was a deliberate choice that people made because they intended this consequence. But by and large, whenever you get into the genealogy of intellectual ideas, drawing a strict line of causality and cause and effect is a fool's project. It's overdetermined by so many different things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you and Charles Taylor would agree on that, that the story is kind of a tragic story,
Yeah.
right, of unintended consequences. And I mean, let's just take one example so people kind of know what you're talking about. Nominalism in your subheading for this class. It's from nominalism to nihilism. Maybe just tell people who came up with the idea of nominalism, what it is, and how that event, while like he had good intentions, right,
Yes.
led to thinking that led us further towards secularity.
Yes. Okay. It's. I'm going to try to explain it as simply as I can. It took me a long time to get a grasp on it. You can trace it back to two late medieval philosophers, Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. William of Ockham, who gave us Occam's razor. And they were trying to simplify our conception of the world. And they ended up saying that universals, things such as the good, the true, the beautiful, don't have any existence of their own. They're merely qualities that we observe that physical, actual concrete things share. And this sounds safe enough, but it ended up having a lot of consequences. God at the same simultaneously becomes closer and also more remote. Reality is flattened. For the church fathers and the early medievals, faith and reason are included in the generic framework of participation in the mind of God. Mm-hmm. So while God is transcendent, we are suspended in being through God's existence. The divine becomes remote, unknowable. Nominalism is the loss of the idea that things have a nature. Mm-hmm. there's no such thing as God's nature now. God's actions become subject to his will, which can be arbitrary. There's no more human nature. Human nature now needs to be defined. We need to define our own human nature. This reaches its climax really in Justice Kennedy's comments in the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case. Words that refer to universals, the good, the true, the beautiful, are only words and don't correspond to anything in reality. So it holds that these things are only names or concepts, but they don't exist outside of our minds. So we can tie this into an examination of God's nature. This is one of the problems that really was very troublesome for the late medievals. How do we know what God wills?
Mm-hmm.
It all comes about as a loss of this sense of the existence of universal truths.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, one of the things that I love to point out to people because I'm a political theorist, so maybe it's just a disease of the profession, but those those big ideas of a philosophic nature really do have like massive real world consequences, and that's why it's important to understand them. They may seem kind of obscure, like nominalism. Most people probably have never heard the term, right? And yet
Right.
the uh, the turn of thought of these fellows led to huge changes in the way that people related to God and the way they related to the world, and eventually political and economic changes. I think it fed into the scientific revolution a great deal, did it not? Like,
Yes. Yes, it
yeah,
did. Yes.
right.
Um, and you're right about that. These ideas that in one generation will seem arcane and obscure, a generation or two or a century or two later are taken for granted. Um, you see examples all over the place. You look at, say, the nihilism of Nietzsche and Sartre's idea that existence precedes essence. Very rarefied ideas in their time, and today I think most high school students would take them for granted.
Hmm.
I think it was Shelley who said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, that these ideas get planted and they gradually spread throughout the culture until we just assume them to be fact.
Right. So part of the project is, and this is something that the Morin Academy does more generally, right? Like is try to cut through our existing current prejudices or whatever you want to call them, our perspectives, to see beyond that, that hopefully will allow us the freedom to make different choices, right? Uh,
Yes,
there's something about that whole trend towards empiricism that made it really difficult, if not impossible, for people to have the imagination necessary to actually relate to something bigger than themselves, right? And this is
yes,
cause this, I think this is what you're talking about is that spiritual crisis is literally we've sort of built a wall up between our minds and any sort of transcendent reality. Um,
yes, yes. And when
so
we build that wall up, we're at the same time building a wall up between ourselves.
yeah, right, right. What the connective glue is missing.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
right. Well, this is um I think a class that anybody should be interested in. I mean, we're going to have a very diverse audience.
hmm.
Um and so, like why should anybody regardless of whether they happen to be a Christian or not take this class?
Oh, just partly to help figure out how do we get to where we are? Who are we? What's the meaning and the purpose of human life? What are the other ways that we've had historically of conceptualizing our existence? So, I mean, it's thinking there are a lot of people working on this topic right now. People
Mhm.
like John Milbank with Radical Orthodoxy, and Charles Taylor, and Eugene McCarraher, and Bishop Robert Barron. These are all people who are saying things that would resonate with this. So I'm just trying to summarize and present some of their ideas essentially.
Yeah.
Hans von Blumenberg is another one. Del Noce.
Okay.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so it's there's a lot going on in this area now. So I'm just
Hmm.
gonna. We only have what 4 hour and a half classes, so
Right.
it'll be fairly compact.
Well, that can be good, a good way for people to and get enter into that conversation, which too often is kind of too exclusive, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I like that. And are you going to have readings or suggested readings, or are you just going to, which I mean,
Uh, I think I'll probably have a couple of internet articles on there as suggested readings, just
okay,
to try to present somebody else's presentation of these ideas I'm talking about, because they can be kind of slippery, kind of hard to grasp. As you said, nominalism. I mean, my education was in philosophy, and it took me a while to even start to grasp what they were talking about with.
uh-huh.
So it's yeah, I'll have a few light readings from internet articles as optional readings.
That sounds great. Yeah, I had the same experience. I That was a hard one to wrap my mind around, even though I'd already encountered it with Hobbes. Hobbes
Right.
totally, but it wasn't called that, and it wasn't. I don't know. You're right. It's slippery. So like any help is welcome, and we appreciate you doing this. Is there anything else that you wanted to say to folks about the course?
Um, no, I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm looking forward to the building of community that we'll have together.
Yeah, thank you. Well, our mission is the clarification of thought, as Peter
Yes.
Bourne said, right? That's important. This course is definitely going to help with that, and I'm looking forward to it too.
Thank you, Laurie. So am I.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.